if I'm someone who's listening to this going, wow, this NIST stuff sounds great. Ron sounds like a great guy. We should be looking at this. Where does NCSF? Because a lot of people ask me about the NIST cybersecurity framework and how does that fit in? And should we be looking at that? It's guidance towards, it's voluntary guidance for critical infrastructure, right? How does that fit into with the rest of the work that you're doing? And I don't even know what your role was or wasn't with NCSF.
Well, this is another great story, and it started out with another executive order. This was during the Obama administration, and what they discovered is that NIST had produced all of these wonderful standards and guidelines for the federal government, but the critical infrastructure, the private sector, really didn't have anything like what we had at NIST. And so they were very concerned. This goes back probably to 2011 timeframe, and the actual framework was finalized in 2014. But there was a big concern with all of our critical infrastructure sectors, which would include things like the electric sector, the financial services sector, the defense industrial base, the communications electronics sector, they're first responders. There's so many critical things going on today where computers are at the heart of these operations. And those computers, the software, the firmware, the hardware, it has to be trustworthy because you're supporting critical missions and business operations. And if you fail at the wrong time, not only can the system go south and your operations can stop, but people can die. And so at that time, the executive order tasked NIST to go out and work with the critical infrastructure sectors to develop a cybersecurity framework. And it took NIST about a year to do that. I was not involved directly in that. A lot of people think I was, but we have a great team at NIST, and there's a lot of people that were working on that project. Donna Dotson, Kevin Stein, Matt Scholl. We had a lot of the people that you may know from NIST. And they did a round robin. They crisscrossed the United States of America, having, I think it was 5 workshops, and they produced several drafts of the document. But when it was done, it was supposed to be, it is a document that's voluntarily applied by the private sector. Now, when the Trump administration came in 2017, one of the first executive orders that President Trump had was to make that framework mandatory for the federal government as well. So now, like they say in Houston, in NASA, Houston, we have a problem because we've got 2 frameworks now.
Yeah, exactly.
So the private sector had one framework, which was voluntary. Now the feds have 2 frameworks, and they're both mandatory. So we had a little bit of an issue here. It's not a bad problem. In fact, it turned out rather well, and we're still working on that resolution. When we did the update to the risk management framework in 2018, we said, how can we use the best concepts in both of these frameworks? In other words, the frameworks are different. One's a risk management framework, one's a cybersecurity framework, but they both have strengths and weaknesses. The strength of the cybersecurity framework is in its simplicity. You've got the 5 top-level functions, and then identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. Under each one of those, you have the categories and subcategories, and then you got the informative references, which actually reference the different security control sets from around the world to include the ISO 27001. The NIST controls are there, 853. You have the NERC SIPs for the electric sector. You've got COBIT, and I think there's one other one there, I think, as well. The CIS top 20 controls are there as well. So it's a big tree structure, and it brings in 3 different types of elements of that framework, from the core to the implementation tiers and all of that. So that's a great way to communicate with senior leaders, because look, you're not going to get a senior leader to understand the details of 853. And sometimes you're not even going to get them to understand the authorization, the ATO, which maybe consists of 300 or 400 pages of documentation. But what they can understand is the cybersecurity framework. So it allows the organization, and you mentioned earlier, if you don't have senior leadership understanding and involvement in cybersecurity, nothing good is going to happen downstream in that organization. So the huge contribution of the cybersecurity framework, whether you're public or private sector, is it allows the senior leadership to understand the problem, and then it gives them a vehicle on how to start to execute. So in 837 Rev 2, we took the CSF apart and we actually have little tag pointers at every task in the RMF where it relates back to a specific part of the cybersecurity framework. And that's hoping to get our agencies to use both frameworks. For example, I'll give just a quick example. And the cybersecurity framework can be used to understand, you create a profile. You have a starting state in your framework, and then you have your goal state. And so that starts to sound a lot like my control selection process. I build a profile of what I would like to achieve in my organization with regard to cybersecurity. And that can actually form the basis of your security plan or your control selection process. So we talk about in our risk management framework, RMF 2.0, how can you actually do that and use both frameworks together? Mm-hmm. We don't just use the baselines anymore to do our control selection. We now, because of our engineering guidance documents, you can now drive your control selection from an engineering-based approach as well. So let's say you're building a new system and you're going through all the requirements engineering at the front end of that. Once you get your set of system level requirements, where a subset of those are designated as security requirements, you can then specifically take those requirements and map those to specific controls, which can be implemented to satisfy those requirements. So it's a top-down driven process based on good systems engineering. Or you can go back to the enterprise approach and take the moderate, low, high baseline and do tailoring.
Gotcha.
Or you can use the cybersecurity framework. The important point is you give your customers choices. Pick a framework that you feel comfortable with, but make sure once you've got that, you do a good job of executing. And if you can do that and give your customers choices, there are many, many different ways to get to a good secure solution.
Right.
And once we understand that, we've got the whole set of tools in our toolbox to help our customers do that.
So